Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Fegan and I read 30 books in 2020. My goal was to read 50, so the bad news is I didn't complete my goal, but the good news is I read few enough books that I can probably talk about all of them in one video, so let's just get started. In this video, I will be ranking every single book that I read this year from worst to best, and talking at least a little bit about what I thought about them. One final stat before we begin, I mostly read books that I like. I'm pretty good at knowing my taste, so I had 9 5-star books, 15 4-star books, 4 3-star books, and only 2 2-star books, and no 1-star books, which was really nice. Up first at number 30, we have Dermaphoria by Craig Clevenger. This is about a man who wakes up from a coma, I believe, and only remembers a girl's name, and he realizes he's part of the drug trade. I think Craig Clevenger's other book, The Contortionist Handbook, is very good, but this book really just feels like low budget Chuck Palahniuk in all the worst ways. It's not terrible, but really it just kind of went in one ear, went out the other ear. Number 29 is still a 2-star read. It was Tender Buttons by Gertrude Stein. I have massive respect for Tender Buttons, and yet I think I am of the group of people that doesn't actually enjoy reading it. If you don't know what Tender Buttons is, it is kind of, I don't really even want to call it prose, I don't really want to call it poetry, but it is a collection of fragments about objects or places or foods, and it's intellectually fascinating, but as a reading experience, I can't say I loved it. Now we are getting into our 3-star reads, and the first one, number 28, is Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare. I would like to say that I enjoy Twelfth Night as a play, however, I think that reading Shakespearean comedies is a bore because you don't get any of the comedic beats that you need when you actually see it live. Twelfth Night is about a whole mess of royals and mistaken identities and love and weirdness, and it's good, I like the plot, however, I would never suggest to anyone, hey, you know what you should do today? Read Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare, so I'm not going to recommend it here. Number 27, and this so very saddens me to say, is Diary by Chuck Palahniuk. I read this for my first video back on this channel. This was my favorite book for like 3 or 4 years of high school. But it just doesn't hold up for me anymore. I just think it's kind of gimmicky at this point in my life. I think it's kind of like David Fincher's earlier movies where he's trying to be flashy and it comes across as insincere as opposed to really moving or eye-catching or interesting, and unfortunately I think that Palahniuk kind of drops a ball on this one. Number 26, we have a poetry book called The Eyelash and the Monochrome by Tiziana Lamelia. I took a class on Gertrude Stein during my final semester at college in the spring, so actually a lot of my books are from that. So this poetry book is kind of a spiritual successor to Tender Buttons, if you will. It's about objects, it's about things, it's about thoughts. And I don't remember too much of it because I was reading it when the pandemic was starting, and Gertrude Stein wasn't necessarily the #1 thing on my mind, but I remember liking it, just not liking it enough. And my final 3-star read was Ariel by Sylvia Plath. This is another poetry book. This I actually read for another class in the spring, so it's also kind of in the distant memory. I like Sylvia Plath generally. I think some of the poems in that were good. I just think as a general poetry collection, and thinking about it compared to the other poetry collections I read this year, there was just not a single thing that really stuck with me. Her style wasn't individual enough, so it kind of, again, went in one ear, went out the other. Number 24, and moving on to all my 4-star reads, we have The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by, I was just gonna say Sylvia Plath, by Gertrude Stein. This is a book that Sylvia Plath wrote from the perspective of her lover, as if it is an autobiography, and also as if it's kind of like a biography of her life with Stein. You still have that really interesting Steinian contemplative nature and the weird things she's doing with language. I actually just think it's a lot more cohesive when it's in this narrative form. I remember more passages from this than I remember from Tender Buttons or any of the scattered poetry we read. So if you're looking to start with Stein, I actually think I would suggest this from my limited exposure to her. Number 23, and I see this kind of with an asterisk, and I'll explain why, is Looking for Alaska by John Green. By no means is this list an objective one. This is a list of my experience of reading these books, and I think if I picked up Looking for Alaska for the first time now, it wouldn't be a 4-star read, but it meant so much to me, and I think that for a YA book, it's actually doing a lot in terms of dealing with questions of the universe and mental health. It's also problematic at points, I know, but I, again, reread this when I first started this channel up again, and reading it was just kind of like a very warm, nostalgic feeling, so it is number, what, 23 on my list of 30. Next I have Night Sky with Exit Wounds by Ocean Vuong. I read this for the Buzzwordathon this year along with Twelfth Night and a book I'm gonna have later on in this video. This is a book of poetry that is really smartly handling the questions of family and love and memory, and I think that this book, first off, I think some of the individual poems are so beautiful, but I also think that the way it tells a story from the beginning to the end and is just sequenced so well, and is a really nice example, I think, of modern poetry done well. Up next, number 21, we have Trimmings by Harriet Mullen, which is another poetry book that I read for my Stein class. If we can have a secret, you and me viewer, I remember nothing about this book. I know that I forwarded on Goodreads, and when I went to check the little blurb on Goodreads to see if it can give me any hints, there wasn't even a single word written, so you're just gonna have to take my word for it that it was good, and if you want poetry that is kind of in the spirit of Stein, check it out. Number 20, we have Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. I read this for my video where I was reading book recommendations from paid book recommendation service TBR. This is about a group of high school students who are in a theater program, a very rigorous theater program. And that's just part 1. I can't tell you what happens in parts 2 and 3, but I think that this book has a lot of the trends that I like in literature, including fiction within fiction and truth within truth, and where do you find actual truth in the stories we tell. Up next we have Sympathetic Little Monster by Cameron Awkward Rich. I took a class also in the spring on trans literature, and this was one of the books that I read for that, and it was easily one of my favorites. This is a poetry book grappling with being a trans black man and so much more. I don't want to reduce it just to that, but I think that what poetry can do best at its best moments is like put you in someone else's shoes so accurately, and I think Awkward Rich just translates his experience so beautifully through his language and through his style, and I was really blown away with this. I know it's only, what is it, number 19 on this list, but all the books that I'm talking about from here on out I really enjoyed, and I loved this. Number 18, another recommendation from TBR, and that is Weather by Jenny Offill. This is a kind of slice of life-y episodic book about a woman, a mother, during the 2015-2016 election era, general time period of political upheaval. Well, on the one hand, the issues it's tackling aren't the biggest issues, it's just kind of like, how do you do life when there's all this trauma all around you? I do think that it handles that very well, and I like the way it was told. It wasn't just a full, complete narrative of sense. It really was told in these, like, episodes and moments, which is something I'm really drawn to. Number 17, we have On the Road by Jack Kerouac, which is a wonderful book for a wandering soul such as I. This book is about a couple of guys who are on the road, kind of going back and forth across America, intent on not settling down and being adrift. I haven't read a ton of beat literature or beat poetry, but I think from what I can gather, like, what you're here for is not necessarily the plot, but more how it feels, and that's kind of what I'm drawn to in literature, that, like, yeah, there's not necessarily a super hyper plot from the beginning of the book to the end, but the way you get to, like, live in these characters and in these dynamics and just in their experiences, even in the small moments, I think is done really, really well, and I want to read more Kerouac, and I want to read more beat stuff. Number 16, we have some incredibly topical content. We have The Plague by Camus, which I read early on in quarantine in the spring. You guessed it, it's about a town that is infected by the Black Plague, and they basically get completely shut down. People can't come in or exit, and how the town deals with that. On the one hand, I love Camus' prose. I think he is a brilliant prose writer. I think that the way he writes lyrically is actually his best writing. I'll talk about that more later. And so I loved reading this. At the same time, it made me depressed as hell, because this book kind of intends to show that in a time like this, humanity would have moments of shining. And I don't think that's my experience of the world right now. I think my experience of the world is that you're seeing the worst of people, and so reading this was kind of like, ah, that's nice. I mean, there's death and there's trauma and there's destruction, but yet I still feel like there's a glimmer of hope in here that I don't see in our real actual world. Great! Number 15 at the midway mark, we have How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. This is a memoir and one of the only nonfiction books I have read the entire year. This is mostly about Jones growing up as a gay black man in the South. You kind of follow him through early childhood, through young adulthood. And again, I think this is just a situation where you have beautiful writing coupled with exceptional storytelling that tells a story that is undertold. Jones's story isn't out there really in novels or in films or anything, and so he gets to tell his story here, and he does it so well and with so much emotion and talent. And again, I rarely read nonfiction, and so when my TBR person chose this for me, I was very happy because I really enjoyed this. Number 14, we have Nevada by Imogen Binnie, and I am obsessed with this book. This is about a trans woman living in New York City as she kind of tries to grapple with holding on to like her punk rebellious roots while like having to have a job and be a part of capitalism, which sucks. Something I'm very aware of as my position as reader is that I can't always speak to how accurate or how respectful something is, because if I'm not reading about my experience, I might miss certain things that are out there. But from everything I've read, I've just read so many reviews and stories of this book being so inspiring and feeling so representative, and I read this for my class on trans literature, and just the discussions we were able to have, just both on like a personal level of seeing into this woman's life and on like an objective level, like what this book teaches people who don't understand what it's like to be trans. Just, I know one book cannot speak for an entire experience, because there is no one experience. I'm rambling here, but it was just a beautiful, beautiful story, and I really recommend it. Number 13, we have Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which remains to this day one of my favorite classics of all time. You might think of the monster as the green guy with the bolts. You are so wrong. Young Dr. Frankenstein, I think he's recently 18, goes to college. He has the hubris of someone who wants to be a god. He creates this monster who learns to be so intelligent, and this is about the hubris of man. It's about male-male relationships. You have my word on that. It is about learning and being a person and being a consciousness, and I think maybe this is a 5-star book. Maybe we're discovering something about myself right now. This also, again, has one of my favorite tropes of writing within writing, because the frame of this book is in letters and in like speaking. It just has everything. Frankenstein has everything you can want in a good classic. I love it. Number 12, we have Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Anzaldua, and this is a poetry book that, again, I read for a class in the spring. This book, or at least the edition I read, was half essays and half poetry, some in English, some in Spanish, basically about being on that border right between Mexico and Texas, and what it is like both living there and how your language is formed from being on a borderland. I think poetry is literally the perfect vessel to talk about language, because poetry isn't just narrative, it isn't just story, it is so reliant on the language. And so in these poems that are so expertly woven between English and Spanish, like, the words aren't just their meanings, they are the language, and I loved it. I think it was done so brilliantly, and this is one of the things I read in the spring that has stuck with me the most. Number 11, which is still a 4-star book, which might surprise people, is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, who is probably my favorite writer. Mrs. Dalloway takes place over the course of a day as Mrs. Dalloway is hosting a dinner party, and Virginia Woolf does what she does best, which is writing the interiority of people. There are less scenes in this book where action happens and more moments of consciousness, moments of thought, and moments of existence. And she does that so well. I personally think Virginia Woolf is better on a second read, because you're able to kind of be immersed more and leave any confusion you had behind, because I do think there is a healthy mix of confusion and enjoyment when you read Virginia Woolf, so I will probably reread this again in my life, and maybe the rating will go up. And number 10, my final 4-star book, is Beneath the Wheel by Hermann Hesse. Hesse? I do not know. This is about a young man in his forest village who is basically grappling with these ideas of conformity and academia versus the power of nature and true living, which is something I think we can all relate to. Sometimes you want to quit your job and watch the sunset, and in a very more intellectual way, I think this book is kind of confronting that question of what do you do when you have things to do but you want to experience the world. And now we have reached my 5-star books. Number 9 is Last Night I Sang to the Monster by Benjamin Alire Saenz. Again, this kind of has an asterisk. I don't think I would pick this up for myself nowadays. I'm not super drawn to YA literature anymore, just on a first read. But given YA, the category, if you will, I think this does everything you could want from a YA novel so well. It is a rich character study. It is honest without being too cynical or being too overly hopeful. It is honest about what it is like to be a teen, but it also treats the main character like an adult and like his problems are real. By the way, Zach, the main character, is a recovering alcoholic who is currently in rehab, and that is the basic premise of the book. So yeah, if you are looking for an amazing YA read, this is still the one I'm gonna recommend to anyone pretty much. Number 8, we have Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. I really wanted to read this before I was out of college because it is one of the biggest books I know of about college-age students, and I am so glad I read it, even though I think I did technically finish it while it was in quarantine, so it wasn't the traditional college experience, whatever. This is about some college students in Japan, and it is heartbreaking, lovely, realistic, dynamic, gorgeous, sad, and everything in between. Kind of similar actually to Last Night I Sang to the Monster. I think it so accurately handles youth, like the characters feel young, but their problems are not presented as fake or as youthful. They feel just as fleshed out as any good old adult novel would have their characters. I'm a very visual reader, so I have like places where all my books take place, and there are certain scenes in this where just like the scenes are so vivid in my head and continue to stick with me. Number 7, we have Bluets by Maggie Nelson, which is a prose poetry book that is so gorgeous. Maggie Nelson set out to write a book about blue, and what you have is a book about the color blue, the concept of blue, the emotion, the feeling of blue, heartbreak, breakups, love, and everything in between. Prose poetry, I think, is something that when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong, and when it goes right, it is some of the most beautiful writing out there, and Nelson just has such a way with words and such a way with sequencing, because this is told in like little numbered moments, and it's gorgeous, it's amazing. I'm just gonna be gushing all over these books. Number 6 is If on a Winter's Night a Traveler by Italo Calvino. This is a postmodern classic that is basically a collection of short little novel stories interwoven with chapters about you, the reader. I love things like this. As I have said this entire video, and something I think I'm learning about myself, is I love that kind of postmodern thing of mixing together reader and story and truth and fiction, and this does all of that so well. Number 5, in the most Nicole stat of all time, we have Lyrical and Critical Essays by Albert Camus. Albert Camus is 4 things. He is a novelist, a philosopher, a critical essayist, and a lyrical essayist. And the thing that gets talked about the least, but is easily the best, are his lyrical essays. The single best thing he ever wrote is Return to Tapasa. If you want to find it, it is about a 7-minute read. You can literally find it on genius.com. It is probably my favorite written thing ever. He is writing about Homeland and about his childhood and adolescence and adulthood in Tapasa and Algiers, and you just get so much love radiating from each of these stories about where he grew up and where he feels like has the most light and love in this universe, and it's just, I could talk about this forever, but this video is probably already 30 minutes long. I've picked up my final stack of books, and number 4, we have The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This is about a college student named Zach who picks up a mysterious book in the library one day and realizes that one of the stories in this book is a memory he has from his childhood, and through this he discovers this starless sea. I almost don't even want to tell you more about it, but this is about community and about sacred spaces and what we would go through to keep these sacred spaces. I think first off I'm really drawn to her writing. The Night Circus is probably one of my top 5 favorite books of all time, and she just writes in these lush, gorgeous sentences, but at the same time this idea of space and hidden space is something that really matters to me, and I think this question is of like, preservation, I think, is something that this book is really interested in, and I think it handles that just so well. Number 3 I thought was gonna be my number 2, and it's not, and that is The Stranger by Albert Camus. There's been a lot of Camus in this video. I reread this at the beginning of my channel because this was my favorite book throughout the beginning of college, and it holds up, honestly. I am here for The Stranger for its philosophical discussions and for what it's saying about the universe. And while I don't always agree about its conclusion at this point, I think this gets the absurdist point across so well. There are scenes in this book that I think move me more than almost any other writing can move me. The last 3 pages in particular, this just like burst of emotion. I haven't even talked about what the book is about. Wow. This is about a man named Merceau who essentially is completely ambivalent to all of life's goings-ons. In the middle of the book, he commits a heinous crime. In the second half of the book, he's on trial for seemingly the crime, but basically he's on trial for not caring about life. It's thought-provoking. You might be pissed off. You might love it. At any rate, I recommend it. Number 2, a surprise upset. We have A Coney Island of the Mind by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I think it's tough to get into poetry because sometimes you just don't know where to start. And if you are looking to get into poetry that is evocative, well-sequenced, easy to read, but still incredibly thought-provoking and dynamic, I would recommend starting here. I'm honestly just gonna read from the back. Ferlinghetti felt that these poems were a kind of Coney Island of the mind, a kind of circus of the soul. And I think that lends this book to such an interesting exploration of life and what it means to be a human. Probably my favorite poem of all time, called Junkman's Obligado, is in this collection, which somehow has said everything I've ever wanted to say about life. And finally, number 1, which is not a surprise to anyone who knows me, is The Waves by Virginia Woolf, my favorite book of all time. I have read this 3 times now. I read it in the summer of 2016, the summer of 2018, and the summer of 2020, and I will read it again in the summer of 2022, and so forth and so forth. This follows 6 friends from childhood to death, and the book is told basically in these internal soliloquies that narrate the goings-on and narrate their lives. And it's everything I want. The most beautiful writing I've ever read in any piece of literature. The most interesting explorations of what it's like to be a friend and what it's like to be a human, what it's like to care about things. I've kind of developed this theory that each of the characters subs in for something essential that you could care about in this world. So creativity, love, mind, nature, wealth or status, and the body. And I think what Woolf does so successfully is she doesn't pick a side. She doesn't say, oh, the way Neville lives is the way you're supposed to live, or what Ginny's doing is abhorrent. She is presenting these lives so tenderly and so accurately and just with so much love. Like, there is just life radiating from every single sentence in this book. I want to recommend it, however I also think it is a very daunting task as the first Virginia Woolf book you read. I might recommend To the Lighthouse first, which I think is a little bit more accessible. But this is not a video for recommendations, this is a video of rankings, and this is my favorite book I read this year. I hope you enjoyed this video, or got some recommendations, or just liked listening to me talk. This is what I do these days. Next year, in theory, I want to actually read 50 books, but I also plan on reading Infinite Jest at the beginning of the year, so we'll see if I actually get to 50, given that one of the books is 1,000 pages long. At any rate, thank you for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one.